Great pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invitation, Ben. What I'm going to talk about today is based on my current work, The Kingdom of Shadows, where I'm going to study the history of the practice and idea of projection in the late 17th, early 18th centuries. And there, quite exceptionally, I would say, just by mistake, I also then encountered something that would perhaps serve as a certain kind of genealogy for the contemporary world in terms of the economy and the political reality in which we live. I mean, the economy of finance and the political reality of neoliberalism. And in my previous work, the biopolitical screens, I was precisely working on the contemporary context, the context of what sociologists at least call neoliberalism, and the context of populations, or rather individuals, one would not say, not populations anymore, just individuals who are self-interested, egoistic, pursuing their own motivations and goals, which are mainly economic and financial by nature. Individuals who are made competitive, to make compete one another all the time. Individuals who are fearful of a looming disaster, looming crisis, which can be of economic, of natural, or something else like a terrorist attack. Individuals with that who are also strategically, one could argue, ignorant of the consequences, the material consequences of their actions when it comes to the others, which can be the nature or the others which are not us. So anyway, this is not the reality I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the history, the historical background of this world. And what I'm doing today is an attempt to think about the mediations that have underpinned the birth of modern capitalism around 1700. And this undertaking then, or at least an attempt, takes us from the development of empirical science in the late 17th century, England specifically, to colonial travel and trade, to the so-called financial revolution that took place in the 1690s, 1700s, and the systematization of speculation, the idea of speculation as a mode of capital accumulation. So what I'll try to do is to give an account of these kind of developments from my viewpoint. My attempt is to do this by looking at one specific image that hopefully discloses more than appears in the first instance. And one word of warning, I have to say, I'll be working quite closely with historical material, so historical detail, which seems to be the method I prefer nowadays. So please bear with me if the following kind of seems to be quite obsessed with stuff, if you will. But my aim is precisely to come up with some more general conclusions by moving from one observation to another. And the following is based on an article manuscript. It's not the article manuscript, totally, don't be afraid, but it's based on an article manuscript that will be coming out this year later. And I'm going to do this the North American style, so I'm going to read from the paper, if that's okay. And I'll do it slowly. So the story begins as follows. On December 19, 1694, eminent British natural philosopher Robert Hooke presented a paper to the Royal Society of London entitled An Instrument of Use to Take the Draft or Picture of Anything. And famous for his work on optical instruments and the study of light, amongst many other things, the 59-year-old English Leonardo, as he was called, had basically just tweaked an ancient invention. What he presented to his fellows was a portable camera obscura. And Hooke himself was however, quite quick to acknowledge that this invention was not exactly a thing that had never been done before. Camera obscuras, as known, were originally literally dark chambers, equipped with a small aperture at one wall through which inverted light images were projected on the opposite wall. And these chambers that had been used in the study of light and shadow at least since the 11th century. But by Hooke's times, dark rooms had become key instruments in all sorts of scientific inquiries, alongside aiding artists in tracing the outlines of objects and rendering shadows and tonal values. And significant developments to the design of these devices had also been made. They had become portable boxes by means of which the world could be turned into an optical projection. But these designs, however, were not exactly what Hooke had in mind. Instead of serving as an aid for making fine arts or as an instrument of scientific scrutiny, strictly speaking, Hooke estimated that his invention was to gain particular advantage amongst curious navigators and travelers, for whom it would help to represent, and I take a long quote from Hooke, true forms and shapes, not only of the prospects of countries and coasts as they appear at sea from several distances and several positions, but of diverse inland prospects of countries, hills, towns, houses, castles, and the like, as also of any kind of trees, plants, animals, whether birds, beasts, fishes, insects, nay, of men, habits, fashions, behaviors, as also of all variety of artificial things, as utensils, instruments, engines, ships, boats, carriages, weapons of war, and any other thing of which accurate representation and explanation is desirable. So the picture box, as Hooke called it, the picture box would allow potentially anything to be recorded by lay artists in an appropriate manner. And Hooke described how the box was meant for tracing profiles, for running over the outlines of things with one's pen, indeed for making drafts. And these sketches would be open for future modifications and could later be complemented with proper shadows and light. But above all, the device was to facilitate the abstraction of the world to its outlines. It would translate complex forms, landscapes of distant locations, coastlines, basically any visible appearance on the earth, into a series of lines and zones. Now, we don't know if the design for a camera obscura that Hooke introduced to his fellows was ever actually built. Quite likely not. Yet I've been interested in the imaginary of the apparatus, that for me counts more than its realization. An imaginary that can be witnessed in the anonymous woodcut of the picture box that was published after Hooke's death in the 1720s. And the engraving presents Hooke's model of camera obscura as a rather curious kind of ergonomic design, not merely as portable, but above all as wearable wooden box that could be positioned over the observer's head and shoulders so as to facilitate drawing the sights projected inside the device. And this kind of head-mounted display, if you allow rather anachronistic characterization, would rotate and move with the observer like a semi-natural, even if doubtless uncomfortable and awkward extension of the observer's body. And the draftsman, as you can see, encased in the picture box, surveys a seaside landscape with hilly islands and a castle, tracing something with his pen onto a paper support. The exotic flora suggests a distant location, a faraway place indeed likely to be observed by curious navigators and travelers on their excursions. But for Hooke, the imperative was that by drawing the outlines of things and beings, instead of merely relying on verbal expression, one could attain the true form of the thing described. The relevance of the picture box was for him epistemic, embedded in the production and gathering of knowledge of things distant and foreign, and perhaps even unheard of. The device grew in particular out of the concerns of collecting and classifying distant matters of fact related to the Royal Society's epistemic conquest over foreign and hitherto unexplored parts of the world. Now, the Royal Society of London itself was operating in a world of expanding horizons. The Kingdom of England had been growing as a maritime power during the 17th century, and a group of trading companies had started to establish themselves as global powers. Corporate commerce, basically, needed practical knowledge for its expansion, for setting up new bases, for prospecting for natural resources, for transplanting crops, transplanting people, and so on. And travel reporting was particularly critical for the accumulation of such knowledge. Not only people closely associated with the society, but also ordinary travelers, seamen, and merchants were harnessed to procure reports of their journeys worldwide. These included objects and artifacts alongside verbal accounts, as well as in some cases drawings, even if the travelers' picture-making skills were particularly questionable. Indeed, how travelers' accounts connected observation, description, and matters of fact remained a significant epistemic concern. And Hooke pointed out in his preface to Seaman Robert Knox's book, An Historical Relation of the Island of Ceylon, Sri Lanka nowadays, from 1681, which was written after the seaman was released from his 19-year captivity on the island. The problem of regulating what was perceived as facts, as well as how these facts were gathered. Hooke did praise that truth will be pleased by Knox's memoirs, but more often than not, the flights of the informant's imagination had the tendency and power to overshadow actual states of affairs. Seamen and travellers, Hooke contended, needed instructions as to, I quote him, what is pertinent and considerable to be observed in their voyages and abodes, and how make their observations and keep registers or accounts of them, unquote. So above all, at issue was the truthfulness and integrity of the observer's accounts, that the accounts were worthy of credit, as the secretary of the East India Company suggested in his foreword to Knox's book. And that's a point I will return to. Now, in the autumn of 1683, a few months before Robert Knox was to sail off to Madagascar to take a cargo of slaves to St. Helena in the service of the East India Company, Hooke noted in his diary that he was to present Captain Knox a picture box, an azimuth perspective, and a longitude clock. So the latter two were instruments of surveying and navigation, whilst the picture box in question was quite probably a version of a portable camera obscura designed to be used as a drawing aid. So a dark room, in other words, was to join devices of mapping and delineation on a long journey overseas, purposed for the accumulation of both information and capital. Now, this little anecdote tells us how knowing, at least for Hooke, had become inseparable from the practice of projection, which was meant to guarantee epistemic certainty. Knowing, in other words, had become inseparable from the translucent screen on which the observer witnessed the world becoming its own image. Like in any dark chamber, these images in the picture box were born of light and shadow, going through lenses, bouncing off mirrors, if any, and shrinking or expanding on conical paths. A dark environment would be necessary for these moving pictures to become visible. And what the camera obscura necessitated was a strict separation between the system and the environment, in terms of level of ambient light and dark. So thereby the projective screen came to impose itself between the observer and the environment. The screen turned the world into a flat, two-dimensional plane. It rendered the environment as projected images which embodied the outside as a virtual reality inside the machine. Virtual because the images were deprived of physical existence, but possessed full color, form, and motion in appearance. So in this way, the screen of Hooke's picture box provided a perceptual and cognitive mechanism by means of which the world could be outlined and surveyed. A mechanism by means of which the observer would be able to lay claim to the landscape through framing, looking and drawing. So even if merely a footnote in history, buried in an old publication of Hooke's philosophical experiments, the portable camera obscura did, I would argue, understood in this way, play a particular symbolic role in the Kingdom of England's programme of economic expansion. If not any real deeds, it operationalized an imaginary of colonial conquest, to be sure, but more specifically, an imaginary that linked optical projection with the pursuit of profit. We recall how the Secretary of the East India Company expected depictions of things distant to be worthy of credit. Worthy, we should read this, of not merely trust, but first and foremost of investment and interest. So the Secretary's phrase divulges something crucial here. So projection was to provide the required background knowledge for scouting out new prospects for colonial settlement and trade, and thereby for speculation on yields to come. And here then, in this process, borders between knowledge and possession started to become quite blurry. And I'm going to take an example of this from John Locke, who was a fellow of the Royal Society as well, and for whom the concerns of knowledge were mostly to be considered in economic as well as governmental terms. So knowledge, basically for Locke, was a question of capital accumulation, to put it just really bluntly. From rational and regular experiments, Locke wrote, "We may draw," and I quote him, "we may draw advantages of ease and health, and thereby increase our stock of conveniences for this life," unquote. So knowledge for Locke was purposed to accumulate one's possessions, but furthermore to restore mankind's original dominion over the globe. In other words, to make the earth kind of fruitful and lucrative. So empirical investigations were, for Locke, needed for new innovations and for securing investments. And this somewhat utilitarian conception of knowledge was then complemented with Locke's theory of property, which Locke actually formulated when he was working for his patron Lord Cooper, who owned a lot of stuff in the colonial affairs. And I take a quote from Locke. "As much land as a man tills, plants, improves, cultivates, and can use the product of, so much is his property. He, by his labour, does, as it were, enclose it from the common," unquote. So through labour, property is established. Boundaries and rights of ownership are drawn, and the earth's fruits are reaped. So wealth and possession boil down to the labour of man's body and the work of his hands that are properly his, as Locke said. And so Locke theorized his idea of possessive individualism. Possessive individualism, which tallied with the British colonial project of occupying, cultivating and privatizing foreign territories. Territories that were purposed to be occupied and improved into sources of profit. And it is also in this context that Locke's musings disclose something critical about Hooke's picture box. The dark room, Hooke pronounced, was to allow travellers, I quote, "to take the draft or picture of anything," unquote. In this sense, we can surmise how the apparatus's images were meant to be more than mere depictions of foreign things and beings. They were purposed to operate as acts of enclosure. Acts of enclosure that designated and outlined the things and beings, fruits, trees, birds, hills, rivers, natives, you name it, that were to fall under one's ownership and care. So in Hooke's picture box, and this is crucial in my opinion, projection was a way of sketching things and beings as worthy of credit, of evaluating something as a possible object of investment and improvement. So projection became a key operation in the anticipation of economic gain. So Hooke's picture box basically teaches us how, at the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries, projection tallied with knowing, and knowing tallied with possession. That is to say, to project was to possess. But possess in what sense? And to explore this, let's focus on the anonymous person in the anonymous engraving of Hooke's picture box, who immersed in the device, marches over foreign land, visualizes and appropriates the unknown, the person who, whilst enclosing the earth from the common, becomes himself enclosed into the apparatus's animated visions. Who was this person? We might give the anonymous craftsman the despisable title of a projector, to borrow the words of Daniel Defoe from his first published work, An Essay Upon Projects, from 1697. And the word projector was in Hooke's and Defoe's times used to denote someone who forms schemes and designs, even wild, impracticable schemes. And to project was understood as to throw out, to exhibit a form, as in projecting an image, but also to scheme, to form in the mind, to contrive. So projecting connoted the production of images, internal or external images, that plot, in one way or another, the future in view of making profit. Projecting meant turning the world into its speculative virtual image. And Defoe even labeled his times as a projecting age, an age that is, in his words, swarms with a multitude of projectors more than usual. And by this, Defoe indicated what historians refer to as the financial revolution, which started in England in the late 17th century with a range of economic developments, including the establishment of a banking structure, the creation of a system of public credit whereby individuals and companies could invest money in the government, and the development of joint stock companies, as well as insurance services. And with a particular scorn, Defoe labelled what he regarded as innovations in credit economy precisely as projection. He observed about merchants involved in overseas trade who weighed yields against risks that, I quote, "To these sort of men, it is easy to trace the original of banks, stocks, stock jobbing, assurances, friendly societies, lotteries, and the like." So for Defoe, those joining in market activity, in the transmission of credit and debt, stock exchange, and so on, these people came across largely as self-interested, corrupt individuals, but ones endowed with a special faculty of projecting, as Defoe put it. And this was a faculty of calculating, speculating, and machinating, one that crucially was in Defoe's account birthed in the planting of foreign territories and colonies. And I take a long quote from Defoe. But here then begins the forming of public joint stocks, which, together with the East India, African and Hudson Bay companies before established, begot a new trade, which we call by a new name stock jobbing, which was at first only the simple, occasional transferring of interest and shares from one to another. But by the industry of the exchange brokers, who got the business into their hands, it became a trade, and one perhaps managed with the greatest intrigue, artifice, and trick ever anything that appeared with the face of honesty could be handled with. Unquote. And Defoe was not alone with his sneering observations. For instance, we can take as an example the seemingly well-intentioned gentleman who comes up with the infamous scheme to alleviate and at once capitalize on the famine in Ireland by turning children into livestock in Jonathan Swift's grim parody called Modest Proposal. This person was precisely called a projector by Swift. And Swift's projector was someone who computed and who thereby subjected the fates of individuals and populations to the calculation of prices, statistical scrutiny, and the prediction of economic gain. And the profile of the projector that Swift came up in the modest proposal basically caricatured the physiognomy of 17th and 18th century mercantilists, among them Sir William Petty, a fellow of the Royal Society again, known for developing the science of political arithmetic, an early version of what is nowadays called social statistics. And Petty's ideal was a governmental rationality that worked in terms of number, weight, or measure, and considered different segments of populations and resources in terms of their financial worth above anything else. And this was actually a rationality that Michel Foucault then later called biopolitical rationality. It was born then. But according to Petty, the riches of the state boiled down to its people, who were regarded in the first instance as economic beings that could be divided into categories based on the quantity and character of production. And in the extreme, individuals became nothing but transferable forms of money. And I take a quote from Petty's prose, which is quite telling. So Petty wrote in his treatise on Ireland, actually, that the value of people, men, women and children in England, some have computed to be £70 per head, one with another. But if you value the people who have been destroyed in Ireland, as slaves and Negroes are usually rated, vis-a-vis about £15, one with another, men being sold for 25 quid and children 5 quid each, the value of the people lost will be about £10,355,000 sterling. So the turn of the 17th and 18th century projector, precisely, saw the world through mortality tables, birth rates, casualty figures, quantities of livestock, numbers of buildings, through all sorts of records and grids. And these grids gave expression to the world in terms of constants and regularities, even regularities of irregularities such as accidents. And essential here to the birth of our world today is that the world was no longer a steady dwelling of divine harmonies. Instead, it was made of uncertainties and risks, but also, alternatively, of probabilities and unheard of opportunities for future gain. Indeed, crucial to the financial revolution is how risk, the very idea of the possible, presented itself as something that one could capitalize on. And it was precisely for this purpose that financial services we are familiar with today, such as insurance, were developed. And what insurance did is that it detached the value of objects from actual marketplace exchange and attached it to imaginary transactions. So the value of a cargo, for instance a shipment of slaves, was calculated by imagining a typical exchange that might have taken place, and based on a purely speculative idea of the market. So value of things and beings was no longer tied to literal exchange. It wasn't even tied to the real life of these things and beings, but rather value was freed to float open-ended as imaginary valuations and promises of future payment. So objects and relations became thus not only gridded and crunched by numbers, but referenced in relation to visualizations. Visualizations of what might yet be realized. To speculative scenarios that were located uneasily to many of their contemporaries on the ontological no man's land between what is merely illusory and manipulated and what is not. And the mutations that the concept of property, and I want to stick to these ideas, the mutations that the concept of property underwent in the midst of the financial revolution crystallized this very well. As the historian of economy John Pocock points out, by the late 17th century, I quote him, property, the material foundation of both personality and government, has ceased to be real and has become not merely mobile but imaginary, unquote. So systems of credit, such as government shares, banknotes, and individual traders' bills of exchange, dislodged property from land or goods and indexed it to promises about the future. Basically, what one owned was promises, as Popok points out. And furthermore, these kind of banknotes, bills of exchange, bonds, stocks, and shares bound the signatories, people who signed them, into a kind of set of promises and obligations, and thereby also to one another in terms of shared pursuits and dependencies. So the function of these pieces of paper were as much social as economic. And indeed, not only economic but also significant socio-psychological, even anthropological stakes were at play in this transformation. The development of finance capitalism, namely, accompanied the rise of a new social person who was disinhibited from land and the family tree, and who was now free to attach him or herself to expectations, calculations, and imaginary gains. And I'd like to quote a description of the Rue Quincampoix in Paris from late 17th, early 1720s, which was a notorious location where the trading with futures, trading with these exchanges took place in the city. So the description goes, I quote, "The highest and the most notable persons in the kingdom might there be seen familiarly mingling with the vilest dealers. Nobles did not hesitate to exchange their fairest lands for paper. Others melted down their funds, and ladies brought the produce of their jewels. This strange frenzy, irritating the cupidity of the great dealers, caused the shares to rise with astonishing rapidity. The manner of doing business resembled the flux and the ebb of the sea." Unquote. So on this account, early finance capitalism was far from a poorly rational enterprise. Rather than following any intelligent design, it resembled the play of natural forces in its apparent volatility and unpredictability. And indeed, the early stock market actors appeared as pretty dissimilar from the prudent deliberators described later by rational choice theory. They came across above all as passionate subjects, passionate people ruled by impulses and desires. They were motivated by self-interest, driven by affects and imaginations, and whilst absorbed in their schemes, they did not live in the present, except as constituted by their fantasies concerning a future, as Popok points out. And we need to only look at writings of someone like the Dutch-English political economist Bernard Mandeville from the period to affirm the importance of emotions in the emergence of finance economy. "I believe man to be a compound of various passions," Mandeville wrote, "that all of them, as they are provoked and come uppermost, govern him by turns, whether he will or no." Unquote. So Mandeville saw subjects of the new economy as fundamentally egoistic, desiring beings in pursuit of power and wealth, rather than as innately virtuous or reasonable. And these beings then, according to Mandeville, participated in a society that basically resembled a joint stock company. That is to say, an artificial aggregate of individuals acting on the marketplace, pulled now by this, now by that promise of profit. So what we see emerging here are economic and social relations, within which the question of the government of people became one of managing affects and drives. And here, then, I think, we also can pinpoint the beginnings of the kind of political reality, of course only partly, but partly indeed, that we are experiencing today, and what I kind of touched upon a little in the beginning of my talk. I mean, here perhaps we can pinpoint the beginning of a world that is populated by subjects of self-interest and choice, subjects who are thus by definition desiring subjects, and as such subjects whose actions and desires are managed in terms of the affects and imaginations that serve as their motive force. I mean, for instance, individuals who are made to desire their subjection to a global apparatus of debt, basically, by signing up to a credit card so as to be able to buy the latest installment of the Apple iPhone. Or individuals who at the same time are made fearful of the looming natural, military or economic crisis, because there's always crisis. Individuals whose relations to themselves and to others around them are basically monetized by corporates like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and what have you. But the story I've told points out a perhaps less conventional media historical background for the world we live in today. Namely, what I wanted to show is how the idea and the practice of protection actually crystallized what the new economic realities at the dawn of modern capitalism around 1700 were about. And now in closing, I'd like to turn to one illustration to expound on this. A dwarfish figure named the Knight Singer of Shares, who tramps ahead with his walking stick, his mouth open about to shout something, and carrying a magic lantern on his back. And this is one of the satirical illustrations that the reader encounters in the Dutch folio of engravings called het grote tafel der dwaasheid, I don't know how to pronounce that, the Great Mirror of Folly in English, which was made sometime after a major financial crisis shook Europe in 1720. And the crisis had started in London, as they always often do, with the burst of the South Sea Bubble, which was a scheme made to settle the massive debts that the English government had run after having waged for like 3 decades of war. And from London, then the crisis quickly spread to Paris, and eventually from Paris to Amsterdam. And this crisis was basically one of the first large-scale collapses of the stock market in the history of finance. Collapses which we have become very familiar with ever since. Now, the Singer of Shares roamed, the illustration lets the viewer conjecture, the streets of Amsterdam, selling shares to credulous investors before the bubbles burst, trading when others had already gone to sleep. And of main interest here is the technological metaphor that the engraving puts forward. I mean, the magic lantern on the scheming man's back. And a relatively new media technology during the period. The magic lantern was basically an offspring of the camera obscura, which turned the darkroom's operating principle inside out. Now, shadow pictures could be projected outside the apparatus through a transparent slide by means of a candle or any light source, and a system of lenses and mirrors. And at the sunset, one can imagine, the dwarfish projector took out his technological counterpart and cast virtual images on a canvas for the surprise and wonder of his audience. Images that appeared and disappeared, multiplied and transformed themselves without any apparent cause. And these projections were essentially unfixed from any material referent. They were not determined by the environment, which was a considerable development with respect to the camera obscura. And therefore, precisely these projections provided an apt analogy for the imaginary objects of financial speculation. Objects that were freed from the constraints of real bodies and things, as I noted. The objects of finance were just like the shadows cast by the device. Both credit economy and the magic lantern were operationally premised on the projection of virtual realities into things and relations. Right? Okay, so Hooke's design demonstrated how projection facilitated the colonial process of visualizing the world as an object of knowledge, and thereby as an object of possession. But objects of possession became immediately, as I wanted to show, in this very process, objects of speculation. And speculation, we have seen, was not merely a practice of calculation of prices and proportions, but above all a passionate, emotionally driven enterprise. I mean, turning something into an object of speculation meant virtualizing this object with desires, affects, and imaginations. And this was precisely the second aspect of the practice and idea of projection around 1700. Projection, in other words, became the key format for both a certain kind of globalizing, possessive rationality and an affective imaginary of speculation. I'll end here. The story would of course continue, and the story would become much more intricate than I've been able to kind of show today. But what I've hoped to have done is to be able to shed some light on the beginnings of the kind of reality within which we live today. I mean, the reality which is precisely governed, on the one hand, this kind of globalizing rationality of possession, which can take many forms. It takes military forms, it takes, trade forms and so on. But on the other hand, precisely this kind of affective reality of speculations, projections, and desires, and virtualization of basically everything in the world. Thank you.